Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Carolina Retirement Planners Happy Half Hour. We come to you live every Thursday at 4:30 to bring to you some kind of relevant bit of learning and have some fun while we're doing it. I'm Sam Shukavich, and with me, as always, is my dad, the president and founder of Carolina Retirement Planners, David Shukavich.
Hi,
And
everybody.
hey, Dad. And joining us today, we have a very special guest that we are very excited about. This is Dr. Len Lecci from the Mars Memory Health Network. Hey, Len, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And then I always like to mention behind the scenes, we have Amy Dresky, our director of client fund. She's making all the magic happen and the interwebs connect.
Hello,
Amy.
hello. Happy to be here. I'm so excited about this one. So I know we have a lot of interest, but hello, and pop over this way.
Yes, absolutely. And so if this is one of your first times joining us, I just want to remind you that we don't know that you're here unless you tell us you're here. So feel free to type hi into the chat. And if during the happy half hour you have any questions, feel free to type them in and we will try our best to get to them, as many as we can. And one of the things that we always like to do here on our happy half hours before we kick it off is talk about what day it is. Amy, every day is some kind of national holiday or, some kind of day. And so we like to pick an interesting one and talk about it.
It is. So there are a lot of great holidays today, but I selected it is 45 Day, and that is in regards to albums, record, like a 45 or 12-inch record album. And I asked everybody if they could send in the very first album or 45 that they purchased. So yeah, it was pretty good.
What did we get? Some good answers?
We did. Let's see. Let me pop off and take a look here. So some of the good ones that we had, some people were like not even sure that they had 45s when they were growing up, but I think, let's see, we had some Otis Redding, The Temptations' greatest hit. Oh, let's see.
Everybody's got to remember stacking all those 45s up, so they drop down one by one, right?
Yeah. Super Tramp.
I remember 78s,
Yes, it was
Paris
good.
had 78s, and you get your gun on 78 original cast,
I don't remember any of those things.
We had a couple for Led Zeppelin. We had some Beach Boys. So no, we had quite a few. We had a couple people that were like, "Woof, I can't remember that far back." I mean, I'm gonna have to be on Happy Half Hour this week because, yeah, no, they're not recalling what their first album was. So
yeah, Dad, do you remember what your first album was?
I do not remember what exactly I bought. I didn't buy albums very much till I kind of listened to my parents' albums till I got to college. I think I bought a None Such something, but I honestly don't remember what it was. So, but my parents had I remember listening to the Beatles very early. When I was, but a toddler of some sort. I remember listening to some of their very early albums. My parents bought those. And I do remember a lot of 78. So it goes back.
Dr. Lecci, do you remember what your first album you bought was?
It's tough to remember the one I bought because I had several from my sister that were, so I don't recall which ones I purchased. I know mine were a little later, but I think it was something by Peter Gabriel. So yeah, that was, I think, the first one I actually purchased. I had things like Grease and all that, but those are my sisters. That on Barbara Streisand, she was into musicals. So my older sister drove, unfortunately, a lot of my things I had to listen to.
I embarrassingly enough, the first album that I ever bought, I think it was a cassette tape. And it was the Spice Girls whenever I was in like fourth grade. So I'm not proud of it.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
My music taste definitely went from there.
I'm pretty sure that was my daughter's first CD. So
Maybe it was a CD.
that's so great. I love it.
Well, you know,
It was,
normally we spend some time saying hi to folks and everything, but Len, having Len on is a treat. He's got a lot. He has more he could share with us than we have time for. So I think we may want to turn it over to him, because I know many folks like me on today may be thinking, yeah, I'd like to know more about how to preserve my memory, or, you know, that's one of the things as you get older you think about more often. So although those Sam and Amy may not be worried about it, I know others are. So why don't we turn it over to Len a little early so we can
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, take it away.
Well, thank you. I certainly appreciate that. And thank you for everybody joining us either live or on recording. This is, you know, a lot of times it's one of those topics that grab people in different ways. Certainly as we age, we start thinking about our memory. It's sort of a natural thing. Oftentimes, in fact, I'd like you to just sort of think for a moment, when was the last time you had an incident that maybe led you to think, is this it? Like, have I kind of started to jump the tank, so to speak, where my memory's not working the way it is? And as you think about those instances, you know, it might be something like misplacing car keys, spending an hour looking for your glasses when they're sitting on your head. You know, these kinds of incidents where you have that realization that I'm not quite maybe as sharp as I once was. And the funny thing is we have these memory lapses throughout our life, but they're not as salient. When we're younger, we're not worrying about diseases. You know, if that happens in your 20s, you're certainly not thinking about a degenerative disease process. But as we get older, it makes sense that those things are kind of on the radar. And in fact, just to show you how easily we don't remember things, I'll give everybody just a quick little homework assignment. And that is, I'd like you to think about what you had for dinner the night before last. So think about what you had for dinner. And when you have that in your head, you can sort of say, raise your hand, say, okay, I've got it. I know what I had. I'll look at our pan. Okay, so we got David's nose. Sam, you know,
it's easy. I had the leftovers last night, you know.
Okay,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
good.
I'll let you know. And if anybody has any comments, I mean, feel free to comment and I'll pass them along as well.
So I asked that question only because it's an interesting short-term memory self-test. It's not diagnostic by any means. So if you're still sitting there, normally if I do this in front of a large crowd, there's normally about a quarter of the people are sitting there after a few minutes still thinking, what did I have for dinner the night before last? And what I want to emphasize is that if you're not able to recall it, or if it took you a little bit to recall that, that's part of normal forgetting. And it's part of normal forgetting simply because the way our brain works, it's very efficient in the sense that we tend to forget things that are basically low relevance. So that's an adaptive thing. You don't want your head filled with, you know, your entire menu from the last year chronologically, for example. And by the way, when you went to solve that little question I asked you, you would have done a couple of things. The first thing you would have done is an orientation question, which is, what day is it today? That's the first thing you would have had to answer. And so, you know, for most people, you might have some marker things that tell you what day it is. Maybe, you know, hey, the coffee talk is on Thursday, so that made it easy. But then you had to think, okay, so the night before last, so now you're doing the days of the week in reverse, which is another type of memory. That's actually the first one's an orientation. The other one is a well-learned memory, which is the days of the week. Most of us learn that in kindergarten or first grade. So again, if this is the Thursday, last night would be Wednesday, so the night before last is Tuesday. So now you're thinking, what did I have for dinner for Tuesday? By the way, from the look at David's face, somebody may have made a mistake and think, oh, wait a minute, I was off at the beginning. But then what you're doing is you're now starting to make some orienting things. So you might have said, who was I with on Tuesday? What was I doing? Oh, yeah, I was with oh, yeah, we took the boat to Carolina Beach. Bingo, we were at Stoked or whatever. You come up with your answer. So you're looking for cues around the event of that day. And that's how you would have generated that answer. Now, if you weren't able to get there, as I said, one of the reasons, of course, is that, well, it's a pretty mundane memory. And so unless something unusual happened, like you burned the house down that night, that's not something you're going to, a week from now, even a year from now, you're not going to remember that meal. We can only remember it now because it's really recent. And if it was somewhat recallable, most of us can get it after a few of those cues. But the fact that we won't remember that in a few weeks or a few months doesn't mean that we have some type of disease process. That's called normal forgetting. And as I said, it's adaptive because our brain has to forget some things in order to better learn and remember the important things that we want to remember. Okay, so normal forgetting, by the way, happens, can be accentuated if we are not attentive. So a lot of times when we don't remember something, it's simply because we didn't pay attention to it when it first came in, if you will. So it is still gone, just like if you'd forgotten it. But the truth is, in that case, it's because it never really got encoded in the first place. There are also several conditions that can hurt your memory that have nothing to do with memory directly, like stress. Stress can definitely compromise memory encoding and recall. Depression is a major cause of memory problems, even though it's not a memory disorder, meaning when you treat the depression goes away, your memory returns. And poor sleep. Now, those are sort of the three big ones that we often associate that are not disease related. There are also a number of medical conditions that can cause memory problems. Thyroid imbalance is probably one of the more common ones. If you have some dysregulated thyroid, that can certainly cause some major memory problems. But let's assume for a moment that we kind of, all that washes through, we've sort of addressed all that. What I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes talking about memory disorders. And so I'm going to put up just a couple of slides, not a bunch of them, to sort of highlight this process for us. So let me just start this, make sure, can everybody see that on the page?
Yes,
okay?
You're good.
Good. All right. So when we do talk about memory disorders, the sort of boogeyman in the room, if you will, is dementia of the Alzheimer's type. So want to make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about dementia of the Alzheimer's type, dementia is a very broad category. There are many different types of dementias. One type of dementia, as it turns out, one of the most common types of dementia, especially when you're 65 plus, is Alzheimer's dementia. So what makes it unique to say other types of dementia is that it has a pronounced memory component. So one of the hallmark features is you have a hard time forming and preserving new memories. It's also a progressive disorder, meaning that it's a neurodegenerative. It tends to get worse with time. The rate at which it gets worse can vary a lot from person to person. Typical onset, though, is after age 65, and that's the vast majority of cases. Only 10% are prior to age 65. And of those prior to 65, almost all of them are between 50 and 64. So basically, it's a disease of 50 plus, the vast majority of which are 65 plus. Now, to qualify as a dementia, you have the problems in memory, usually at least one other cognitive domain, and it's causing dysfunction in your life. Now, although this is an important condition, I want to highlight something that is the one that I'm most interested in, the one researchers are most interested in, and the one that doctors really should be most interested in. That's something called mild cognitive impairment, or MCI for short. There's a few different variations of MCI. The one that's of greatest interest is something called amnestic MCI. You see that word amnestic as in amnesia. So this is a mild cognitive impairment that's focused on memory. And it's kind of a localized memory impairment. This is pre-dementia. This is not someone who has dementia, so they usually don't have some tremendous dysfunction or anything like that in their life, but they are starting to experience memory decline. And unlike Alzheimer's, especially more advanced Alzheimer's, people with amnestic MCI have some awareness of it. In other words, they're recognizing that their memory is failing. When you get into dementia, the Alzheimer's type, one of the hallmark features is what we call poor insight. That is, people don't really recognize that memory deficit in themselves. This is going to be important for a detection reason in just a moment. So this MCI time, which is before we get to dementia, is the critical point that we want to catch and treat this decline. And in fact, the reason we want to focus on this group is because people with amnestic MCI, within a 6-year period, 80% of them are going to convert to Alzheimer's dementia. So
Wow.
in other words, this is the audience we really want, because this is a critical time when we can intervene and make a difference in their life. Okay, that sort of sets the table from a disorder standpoint. I'm going to tell you a sad reality that occurs. And that is that currently we as in our society here in the United States and really around the world, we're not necessarily that different from other parts of the world on this point, is we do a really terrible job of catching memory disorders like Alzheimer's and even MCI early. It slips through the cracks. So the typical point at which people get diagnosed, and you can see it here on this graph, this is actually a cleaned up graph of a longitudinal study that tracked people for a long period of time. And what it basically shows is that most people are diagnosed when they're in essentially a profound dementia stage. I'm sure if we could right now open it up and listen to everybody's stories, if you know someone in your family, likelihood that there's someone that you do know that's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, that when it's diagnosed, it's usually diagnosed pretty late, meaning you take the person to the doctor, you might whisper to the doctor, we think they have dementia. But basically everybody other than perhaps the patient knows that they have dementia. Unfortunately, in our first world country, with what should be our first-class medicine, this is what we do. And if I could draw a parallel, this would be the same as if we were diagnosing cancer in its final stage. That's basically what we do with Alzheimer's right now. And that is unacceptable. We should not have a disease where essentially it doesn't get on the radar until a child could diagnose it, because that's what happens in this scenario. Like a grandchild will say, what's wrong with grandpa or grandma? They don't even recognize me. We're diagnosing people when they're getting lost in neighborhoods they've lived in for 20, 30 years. They can't remember their kids' names. That's a problem. That's advanced dementia. That's not early signs. So what I'm going to suggest to you is there's going to be a couple of things we need to do, 2 approaches to essentially fix this problem. And this problem, in order to resolve it, is going to require you to sort of take the bull by the horns, to do 2 things. One is going to be preventative stuff, and we're going to talk about that second. The first thing we're going to do is to talk about measuring your memory on your radar, or more importantly, putting it on your doctor's radar. So when I say things slip between the cracks, it's really no fault of the physician. You know, if you go to a physician's office, you have an average of about 6 minutes with your primary care, whether it's a PA, NP, or a primary care physician. And they've got a lot to deal with, especially as we get older. We've got all kinds of problems. And in that 6 minutes, it's very unlikely that we're going to bring up the memory problem. One of the reasons we tend to not bring it up is, as I mentioned earlier, when people have memory decline, they tend not to notice it very well. It's other people who do, at least especially as it advances. And many people, when they're younger, think they'll be different, like I'll be the one to know when I'm having memory problems. When the reality is, the tool that you're counting on to let you know you have memory problems is your brain, and that's what's going to be compromised, and that's why you're not going to know it when it's happening to you. So we have to rely on some other method to do this. And what I want to show is essentially, if we start thinking about memory disorders in a preventative way, kind of like we do with cancer. Notice that for cancers, when you get to a certain age, you get screened for cancer, because that's a risk factor. You're in that age group. You don't wait until you can see some goiter or some, clear external indicator of cancer. You just have a risk factor, which in many cases is age. That's the beauty of Alzheimer's. As I just told you, age tells us who gets this. In fact, the number 1 risk factor for Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases, other dementias, is age. So we don't have to test 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and probably not even most 50-year-olds unless you have early onset in your family, meaning people are getting diagnosed with dementias prior to the age of 65. For most people, this is on the radar at 65 plus. But at that stage, if you've got some of the risk factors, other than age, the next three biggest ones are blood pressure problems, so high blood pressure, cholesterol problems, diabetes. So if you're 65 plus, you got those three things on your radar, you've got now the four biggest risk factors for developing dementia of the Alzheimer's type. You can add into that if you have a family history for it. That's an additional factor. But those are essentially the big factors that predict it. So what we suggest is that if you're aware of your medical history, these are the kinds of things you want to bring to your doctor's attention. I have these risk factors. These are the top risk factors. I think I might need to, and then if you add to that, I'm noticing some declines. So if that combination is there for you, that's when I would encourage you to talk to your doctor about a referral for an assessment. And here's what that referral will do. So oftentimes, one of the most sensitive ways to notice that someone is having a decline is not just to compare you to how the typical person performs in terms of their memory for your age, but it's also to compare you to you. Essentially, what's your trajectory? So here I'm sort of showing you an individual, hypothetical Miss H. If you're an above average functioning person cognitively, so you're pretty bright, you've always had pretty good memory most of your life, then you might look a bit like Mrs. H, which is the normal individual is in blue and they're performing near a standard score of 0. These are Z scores, so the mean is 0. Mrs. H is well above average, but notice the trajectory of her decline. It's actually sharper than what you would expect with normal aging. Normal aging, in the absence of disease, typically doesn't fall off tremendously. Looking at the rate of Miss H's decline, you can see that she's probably going to look a lot like that slide I showed you earlier, where she might be on the precipice of this more steeper decline. And so the point is that if we're watching her, if we're seeing she's got some risk factors, age being number one, and you had assessed her even just at time 1, you could already see by time 2 that she's having some significant cognitive changes. And you could potentially be aggressive in intervening there. And if you do that, we can change her trajectory. In other words, we can't recover functioning once she's lost the abilities. But if we identify it early, we can put her on that normal course of aging, or at least something close to it. And that's the difference between living independently versus not, when you reach that more profound stage. So one take-home message here when I talk about assessments is know your medical history, know your risk factors, bring it up to your doctor if you have those and you're noticing some memory decline. That's a great way to kind of take the bull by the horns, if you will, and be aggressive in looking at those factors. Here's what you'll do for yourself. By doing that, our goal is that instead of being diagnosed where most people are diagnosed, we can back up catching that to closer to where that yellow line is, 6-7 years before that fall off occurs, when we're at the very early stages of MCI. And as I said, that's where we can then preserve your functioning. You're still living independently in those situations. And that's when you really want to make a big difference in people's lives. Okay. So that's one side, the assessment, and I'll save a few moments just for some questions. I also want to mention something that you can do that doesn't require prescription, but is in fact the most powerful way to preserve your memory that's available to you today. This is referred to as the MIND diet. This came out the very first study came out in 2015. There have been several follow-up studies since that time. But what I want to tell you is that the effects we're going to talk about here are bigger than any FDA-approved medication on the market. They're not even close. So you have this at your fingertips. You do not need a prescription pad to get this. You might not have heard of this because no one stands to make any money off this. If this were a drug, it would be every other commercial on TV right now, but it's not. So what is the MIND diet? Well, essentially, it's a combination of the Mediterranean diet. Many of you are probably familiar with the Mediterranean diet, and essentially a low sodium diet. So that combination diet is what's known as the MIND diet, and it's specifically to target neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So this diet was studied in a large sample, about 1,000 individuals. They tracked them for 4.5 years. These were in the high-risk age. You can see they aged from 58 to 98. So hopefully that encompasses the age range of most of our audience. So this could be you. They randomly assigned people to one of 3 diets. They either did the MIND diet, they did the Mediterranean diet, or they did the diet to lower, essentially low sodium diet, what's referred to as the DASH diet. Now, let me emphasize that these diets certainly can have other benefits for your heart health, etc. I'm going to focus on the implications for the brain in terms of cognitive functioning. They monitored these people to see, well, would they develop a neurodegenerative disease? And here's what they found. The people that followed the MIND diet resulted in a 53% decrease. They cut it in half, the cognitive decline that they experienced over a 4.5-year period. Now, that is a huge effect. There is no drug that even comes close to this. And what makes this effect even more powerful is they actually showed what's sometimes referred to as a dose response curve, which means the people who followed the diet more closely had the biggest effect, this basically cutting in half the rate of decline. But even the people who followed the MIND diet moderately, in other words, they were pretty close to that diet, they showed a 1/3 decrease, so a 35% decrease as well. And by the way, this moderate, while there were some benefits if you were full on following the DASH diet or full on following the Mediterranean diet, not nearly as strong as the MIND diet, but that only worked if you were completely following those diets. If you kind of didn't really follow those that closely, you didn't see this kind of dose response curve like a big effect, which tells you that even though they may benefit in other things with respect to cognitive functioning, it's really this MIND diet that makes a difference. And the longer people followed it, the stronger the effects that we found. Okay, so those sort of a brief summary of some of the critical findings that we have in the literature on this that I wanted to share with you. By the way, the MIND diet, just if you're kind of wondering a little bit about this, if you Google it, you'll find numerous examples, but this is essentially foods that are rich in things like omega-3s. So you want to have fish most days. For those of you who like to eat chocolate, you may eat dark chocolate, not light chocolate, but dark chocolate is chock full of antioxidants. And by the way, we see this internationally too, because parts of the world where they eat dark chocolates have much lower rates of Alzheimer's than parts of the world, like the US, where we eat mostly the lighter, sweeter chocolates.
Mm-hmm.
If you enjoy wine, I heard we're giving away bottles of wine and such. Let me just direct you, a glass of wine a day is absolutely helpful, particularly though if it's the dark wines, the full body dark wines, think of your Cabs, for example, your Merlots, that again, heavy antioxidant properties in those. That's very consistent with the MIND diet, snacking on nuts, berries, etc. So just give you a little bit of highlight so you know what we're talking about. You can Google the specifics of the diet. Wanted to throw that out there, and then I thought perhaps we might take a little bit of time to also take a look at the chat to see if we have any questions that have come in. All right, I love some of these questions in here. Someone actually commented earlier, if you can't remember, how do you know you have memory loss? And I love that comment because that actually is the exact point we made earlier, which is why people tend not to detect it in themselves. And so when you start going down this road of more advanced memory loss, that's exactly what's happening, is you don't have the insight. The people around you often know it. In fact, there's several studies, we've done some of these studies that show that the people around you are much better reporters of your memory decline than you are. But if you're in that MCI stage, you do know. So you do have insight at that point before you sort of jump over to to that dementia. All right. And I'm assuming, let's see, that we have folks typing in questions in there. Amy, I'll leave that to you to jump in. Amy, you look like you had a question.
Oh, no, I was actually just
Sam, sorry.
fascinated.
Oh,
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Sorry,
Do you have any examples of how to differentiate the normal forgetfulness, like you talked about in the beginning of the presentation, and how you might be able to differentiate that from actual early signs?
That's an excellent question. Probably one of the most common questions I get whenever we give these talks. The answer to that, unfortunately, is no. Because if there was an easy way to differentiate it, we wouldn't have this problem of people being in advanced dementia before we detect it. Unfortunately, it takes some pretty sensitive tests in order to do that. Certainly, we can tell the difference again when it's pretty advanced. Like, for example, if I've heard someone say, yeah, if you can't find your glasses, that's normal memory. If you forget what glasses are used for, that means you have dementia. That's absolutely true. That's a pretty good illustration, but that's also a pretty advanced one. If you're at the point where you're looking at a pair of glasses and you have no idea what they're used for, we're not catching anything early at that point. So unfortunately, there aren't sort of tricks to do that. And the reason is because, for one thing, it's pretty idiosyncratic, meaning what are the early signs for Sam, for example? You might have pretty good memory. And so what might be the subtle signs for you are going to look different than, let's say, someone who has chronically poor memory, even though they're then showing some decline.
And I think it's worth emphasizing that Mars is a resource we have here where they can test you and then repeat that over time and catch that decline when there's still drugs available to treat it. And I know that's something we all like to do, to catch it for we forget what red wine looks like,
Right.
And
I actually
Yeah.
sat with a client the other day who had recently come in for her first assessment with Mars and told me that, she would go back every year and they would be able to monitor, her memory.
Yeah.
Is this something that you recommend that people wait until they believe they're seeing signs? Or do you think that you get to a certain age and this might be just a good practice to engage in?
Yeah, so I have two answers to that question. So for now, I would encourage people that when they get to about somewhere in their 60s and they have some of those risk factors, that's a good time to kind of let your doctor know about those risk factors, particularly if you have some concerns. That's a good time to go ahead and get a referral. My long-term desire, and we've been doing this by giving community talks, by doing continuing education with medical professionals in the area, is that we essentially train our system to work for memory disorders the way we do for all other disorders. And I drew the analogy to cancer because screening is standard. You don't go get a prostate exam because you think you've got prostate cancer, or you don't get a mammogram when you think you have breast cancer. You just get it because it's the time to get it, and that's the age at which the risk is present. We need to eventually, and we keep trying to push our community that way, we need to get there as a society for memory disorders. These should be routine. You get to 65, you should have a memory checkup. I mean, it's kind of time to do that. We're trying to get there two ways: to let the community know that it's important, and to let doctors know to pay attention to those risk factors, and don't wait until you look at a patient and say, wow, they look like they have dementia, because at that point it's profound. When they're in there and they've got that blank stare and, kind of like zoning out for several minutes, that's not an early detection. So they need to be looking at that. And for now, that's why we want to empower everyone listening here is, your medical history. So if you sat there and said, yeah, I'm 68, I got blood pressure problems, I got cholesterol problems, I got diabetes, bing, bing, bing. Oh, and my mom had dementia. Okay, those are a lot of risk factors. You should be talking to your physician about a referral.
I think it's best to go to your physician next time you see them and say, can you get me a referral to Mars?
Yeah, we
Then
have
you'll be able to help assess whether that's the thing. So I think some old time clients with us may remember, I think Len spoke to us at the City Club, one of the luncheons we would have more before COVID. And it's great to have you back where we can reach an even bigger audience and kind of ensconce it in our recordings. We have all the happy half hours there to watch on the web, either on YouTube or on our website. If you go to you can find us in the events. There'll be a happy half hour and all. How many have we done now, Amy?
Today is 140, episode 140.
Yeah, so you're number 140, Len. It was great to have you. I hate to go too much over half an hour because people like to, you know, they're all sitting down with a drink and joining happy half hour. And I don't want them to get to 2 or 3 drinks. Or anyway, Sam, what's next? We have one last thing to do.
Okay. All right. So you have to excuse actually, this is my dad's pottery, is the vessel, my substitute vessel for the wine drawing today. If this is your first time joining us, we give away 2 bottles of wine every week delivered directly to your door from Fermental Bottle Shop. In order to get into my raffle, all you have to do is, if you see our little Facebook event, you click I'm going to this event. And if you're on our email listserv and you hear what the event is, then you just respond to that email and tell us what your first album was, or put me in the wine drawing. So this week, this is maybe not the right, our winner of 2 bottles of wine.
Looks nice. Get your drum roll.
I know it's hard to mix it without losing them. Is Susan and Barry R. So congratulations, Susan and Barry.
Congratulations, Susan and
You
Barry.
are our wine winners today.
And
Congratulations.
Again, yes. And again, thank you so very much for your time, Dr. Lecci. This was really informative for me, and I'm still in my 30s. So I did put some worries to rest for me as well.
That was great.
Because I definitely did wake up this morning and forgot what I had for dinner. That was my first thing I had in my head. So
Yeah, I often forget. I'm like, wait, what did we eat? What happened? Yeah.
what is our topic next week, Amy?
Oh, so next week we have a good one. We have QCD, possibly giving the devil's money to God.
How to give the devil's money to
Whoa.
God. That should perk your interest, and it's a powerful technique we want to review with everybody and some of the advantages of it. So
yeah,
we'll
so
see
if you
you.
enjoy charitable giving, talk to us.
I also
So,
want to remind everybody that if you found this interesting, as David said, please find it on our website and share it with those you love and you care about, because it's important.
this is one I know many people, myself included. Our knees go out, they can replace our knee, but if you're wandering around trying to remember what glasses are, it's too late. There's no replacement for that. So Dr. Lecci and the Mars is something a lot of us ought to be thinking really hard about. Well, with that, we got to say goodbye to everybody. Cheers. We will see you next week.
Yes, cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Bye-bye.